It is wonderful to welcome Catherine Pakaluk to this podcast. She is the Associate Professor of Social Research and Economic Thought at the Bush School of Business of the Catholic University of America. And in this hour, we are discussing her wonderful new book, Hannah's Children, The Women Quietly Defying the Birth Dearth. Catherine, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thank you. I'm doing well.
So we're recording this on the solemnity of Good Friday. So I'd like to begin by asking you, what are your plans for Easter?
That's a question I wasn't prepared for, but absolutely. We're going to start today in the afternoon with the Good Friday service. And then over the weekend, of course, a lot of cooking and baking in preparation for the Easter celebration. On Sunday, we have a big family gathering with as many family members are living in the Washington, D.C. area. So I'll be cooking and baking a lot. I don't know, food seems to be a central part of the family celebration. And some of my children from college are home for the weekend. So, yeah. Yeah.
And for those of us who are not Christians or Catholic, which I assume that you are, how would you explain the significance of Good Friday?
Good Friday. I've been reading a lot lately of some popular philosophy works and some articles really reflecting on the importance of suffering in the meaning of human life. And so maybe for people who are non-Christians, I mean, for us as Christians, Good Friday is kind of the moment in the whole year that in fact, we try to extend Good Friday by remembering it every Friday, right? But it's this moment where we have a chance to reflect on essentially the goodness of suffering. I was speaking to someone yesterday on a podcast. It wasn't a religious podcast at all, but she's somebody who said, well, I'm reaching a point in my life where I realize that the best things in life are obtained through hardship, and how difficult it is for us to embrace that, but also how difficult it is for us to willingly choose to suffer in order to get those goods. But I think for me, that's the importance of the reminder of Good Friday. Yeah. So somebody chooses to suffer in order to obtain great good for other people. And it's an invitation for me as a Christian to try to do the same thing.
That's wonderful. And I wish you and yours a wonderful Easter weekend.
Thank you. You too.
So I guess this show is I guess quasi-religious. Religion is one of the many interests that I have, and I guess being a Catholic myself, I'm interested in everything related to Catholicism. Now, upon reading your book, I'm reminded of two things. Well, I should like to mention the first, the book of Genesis, which I recently had a chance to revisit. The first few verses, God commands of Adam and Eve, as well as all things living, to oh my God, I blank on the go forth and multiply, be fruitful and multiply.
Yes.
But after the fall, God's punishment towards Eve is that the process of being fruitful and multiply, i.e., childbirth, will be tremendously painful.
Yes.
I wonder if throughout the research, as well as the profiling of the women that you interviewed, the figure of Eve comes to mind.
That's a great question. So the figure of Eve, in fact, does not come explicitly in the book. But I want to, if it's okay, I'll bring up the figure of Hannah, but I'll bring it up through Eve. So in the Christian tradition, we understand that Eve, I think this is a language that we often think about, that the sin of the world comes through Eve, right? That's something we sometimes say. Now, and there's a lot of tradition around that. Is not to blame Eve. Adam has his role, right? But in a sense, the sin of the sin in Genesis comes through Eve. And one of the reasons we've emphasized that is because the figure of Mary, the mother of Jesus, the salvation of the world comes through Mary, right? So there's this sense in which Mary is sometimes called the new Eve because she redeems the sin of that comes into the world through Eve, right? And so, so if it's okay, I will bring up. So Mary is the new Eve. She's also in a sense a new Hannah. So Hannah is a figure of the Old Testament in the book of Samuel, and it's through Hannah. She's one of the link or the chain of um, the generations in the Hebrew scriptures, but it's through Hannah that Samuel comes in to the line, and through Samuel that the King David is anointed, right? So she has this tremendous role, but Hannah in her effusive praise for God when she conceives, when she understands she will receive Samuel, she has this beautiful prayer of praise, which ends up Mary echoes that. Mary's song of praise after understanding that she would be the mother of the Redeemer. So yeah, so I want to say that Eve doesn't come up specifically, except insofar as this work invokes the way in which the maternity um, of mothers, maternity, specifically the maternity of women in the scripture, stands as a type for the relation of men and women in the world today to God's blessing, God's wish to bless us, and then also God's providence. And so I think, even in Eve's tragic circumstance, we can see that in her own life. And it's brief, of course, for us to reflect on that. But yeah, I think generally the women of the scripture, it's a very powerful theme and one that I found it very fruitful to work into the text. Of course, it wasn't in my mind when I began to write the book, but as I worked to try to understand the meaning of the narratives, that's where I found myself reaching for that. It's the only way I could explain it.
Mhm. Yes, and onto the figure of Hannah. I guess to recap, in the book of Samuel, Hannah
Yeah,
was childless, I believe, and
that's right.
she asked for the blessing of Eli, the priest of that time, and she was able to conceive, and of course, her offspring was the prophet Samuel.
Yes.
And in relations to, well, Mary, in both cases, the case of Hannah as well as Mary, children are considered miraculous.
Yeah.
And I wonder, from your experience as a mother, as well as your um, the process of interviewing, I guess, mothers like the real life Hannah profiled in
Yeah.
the book.
Yes.
To what extent do you believe that that is the case? Children equals miracles.
Yes. Yeah, that's a great question. There are some expressions of something like that in the book. I think one of the moms that I interviewed, who was expecting her fifth baby, she said something like, uh, and it was her fifth, it wasn't her first. She said something like, I still can't believe you could make a baby with your body. Something like it's something that seems really miraculous, actually. So in a sense, right, it's like this, what's the greater miracle that someone who's barren or infertile could conceive and bear a child? That's one kind of miracle. That's the one that the plain meaning of the text, right, is that Hannah's birth is miraculous. Of course, the plain meaning of the text is that Mary, the mother of Jesus, doesn't know man. And so to conceive a child is a miracle. But what's the greater miracle that someone barren would conceive and bear a child, or that a mere mortal could bear an immortal being, right? So, or that we can participate in giving rise to new beings or new creation. So participating in creation. So I think the plain meaning of the text, in a sense, is not the whole miracle. And there's a miracle of which I think the women in my book certainly expressed. And I would say in my own experience, it's very, very true. And I can maybe explain this in a minute. But there's a sense in which any birth, even not a birth that's after infertility or which seems physically miraculous, um, seems like a miracle, in fact, because we recognize that although we play our part in conception, we play our part, but it's outside of the power of my creation. When I look at my 8 children, and I see yes, okay, this one, maybe he looks a little bit more like my husband, or this one looks more like me. So you see the genetic contribution that the parents play or add, but then there's this explosion or this, big bang, if you will, right? The spirit in that child, which you recognize is not your creation. You maybe contributed the biological material, but the spirit is something that is a new creation. There's no sense in which this child is a spirit that's derived from mine and my husband's, right? So that is a miracle every time. And in my own experience, and I think the women in my book testify to this, the as we get older as mothers and we have more children, something works in reverse from, I think, normal life, which in normal life we speak about, if you don't mind me using the word, the diminishing returns to things that are consumption goods, right? So if you have one ice cream, you love it. If you have a 10th ice cream, it's not that great. You go on one vacation, it's special, and the 10th vacation is not as special. But with people, it's not the same. In fact, it could go the other way because there's an art and a habit, a virtue, in fact, of receiving the gift of another person. And so in my own life, I know that, well, I was absolutely delighted to receive my first child. But I remember very clearly when my 7th child was born and I was older and it was more difficult, actually, physically it's more difficult. But I remember when she was born, just looking at her and contemplating the miracle of her and just this overwhelming gratitude that another child had been put into our family in a sense. And it just seemed like gift and miracle completely, like there was nothing else I could say. So how is that possible? Like even more appreciation or more excitement, more joy with the 7th child than with the first child. So like a very contrary reasoning, or not reasoning, but experience. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Mhm. So a little bit of background about me. I was born in Vietnam, so that explains
Okay.
my last name.
Uh-huh.
Was the first, I suppose.
Yeah.
Vietnam has the official government policy limits I guess the number of offsprings per couple to 2.
Oh,
I think the limit has been somewhat loosened in that only those who work in the public sector
okay.
are are subject to that limit, whereas those working in the private sector doesn't. So
Okay.
my parents are public sector workers, so they are subjected to this limit, whereas a friend of
Huh.
my dad who does not. He has his own business. He has, um, I think, 4, as far as I know.
Okay.
Um, but nevertheless, as when I grew up, I only know of um, one set of parents with like one kid, and that
Yeah.
my aunt. But I always know that people who have 2. Obviously,
Yeah.
sometimes there are more than 2.
Yeah.
And what is so amazing about that, even with the limit being imposed, is that women who went through all of that, the pain and the hardship, bodily
Yeah.
and mentally, to
Yeah.
carry a child, carry them to term, of course, and to give birth to them, they would go through that again. My mom is one example. She
Yeah.
gave birth to my little brother after giving birth to me.
Mhm.
So that what makes, I guess, women and mothers so amazing for me,
Yeah.
other
Yeah.
than the fact that they create humans. So,
Mhm.
um, so according to you, what makes what makes going through all that worth it?
Yeah. So, trying to think about different ways to answer what, according to me, what makes it worth it. The there's a line in the scripture actually, which I think is really quite brief and beautiful, where Jesus says, that when a woman is about to give birth, she's afraid, and she's afraid because she knows about the pain she's going to go through. But then he says, but after the labor, she forgets about the pain because there's the joy that a man has come into the world. And it's a wonderful expression. And I think to me, that's what makes it worth it, right? And it's not exactly true that you forget the pain. It's really, you do in the moment, you do. But of course, it's we're rational creatures. We remember things. But yeah, it's worth it. I mean, so later it's like, well, the pain is limited, right? The pain doesn't last forever. And this is, I think, an insight about human life. We were talking a little bit about suffering and the meaning of Good Friday. But it brings us to the edge of these kind of existential realities, right? Nobody could live if painful things lasted forever, so no end to them. No one could live, no one could bear that. But what we find, the pattern of life mostly is, that pains are brief. And even a longer pain is brief in relation to something like eternity. And I think so for me, the joy that a human being has come into the world, but it's not just any human being, right? It's a human being in with whom I have this unfolding, developing relationship. I mean, you love them as a baby. Babies, they have certain gifts that babies bring, but every year, every month, in a way, every week, your child is a new person, right? So my son, who came home for college for Easter, he's 22 now, and I mean, the baby that he was no longer exists, right? That baby doesn't exist. It's in my memory. He was a gift, but I'm discovering every year this new person, right? So that joy just continues. It continues, and the difficulty of his birth is, long in the past, and so that, and I would just add, when somebody, as I do, believes that the human life is eternal, that my children have the possibility of living forever, and I have the possibility of living forever, there's also this added joy. It reminds me of something that Saint Therese of Lisieux said. I think it was her. She said, all this joy, like in this life, and then heaven too. Like, so the joys that our children bring us, which make the pain worthwhile, um, are immense. And I think we don't have to believe in eternal life to appreciate how wonderful children are. But from a Christian perspective, and indeed any perspective that takes a view on the eternity of human life, we realize it's so. When I enjoy my son, who's 22, and all of the interesting things about him, I know that it doesn't have to end. I can enjoy him forever. So yeah, so those are, according to me, those are the types of things that make it worthwhile. Mm-hmm.
Mhm. That's that's wonderful. So the title of your book also references an important work of social research. I
Yeah.
believe it was in the 80s, The Birth Dirt by one Ben Wattenberg.
Yes.
Um, I grew up being being told of I guess the kind of population boom or bomb, as
Mm-hmm.
of the world containing too much people and not enough resources to sustain them. Obviously, this line of thinking sort of begins with one Thomas Malthus and culminated in the 20th century with one Paul Ehrlich. So coming across Wattenberg's text really was a surprise to me.
Mm-hmm.
So, and and I believe in the years since its publication, the conversation around population increase or decrease and um, the fluctuating fertility rate in at least the Western world has changed dramatically. So I wonder to what
Yeah.
extent has that been the case?
Yes. Yeah. So I appreciate your saying that discovering Ben Wattenberg's work is kind of a revelation. I think it has been for many people. I wanted to reference his work in my title in part because I was looking for a pithy way to refer to this overall global trend to low birth rates, right? So it's very interesting that, and I think some consolation for those of us who are committed to say philosophical or intellectual truths that are not in vogue among the elites of the world, whoever they are. It's some consolation to me to see that already, probably forever, but certainly in the scope of my lifetime before I was an academic, but when I was a kid growing up in the 70s and the 80s, we saw the same kind of dynamic then as we do today, so it's like you, when I was in grade school, I heard about overpopulation. I heard about, famines in Africa, and the future was going to be starvation. But even at that time, there were plenty of people saying that's not going to be the case. That's not true. This is not the right reading of the data. And Ben Wattenberg is one of those. There were others as well, but I think for my purposes, he was maybe the right person to remember. I think we have to think of him as a prophet. I mean, he's somebody who even 15 years before he wrote The Birth Dearth in the late 80s and early 70s, he was presenting. In fact, I think he coined the term birth dearth in a small book in the early 1970s. I think of him as a prophet because he said, look, I mean, here's the right numbers to look at. So, yeah. Okay. So you asked about that. So yeah, that's right. Basically, Ben Wattenberg's point was birth rates have been too low already since the 70s. And we will expect, in the next 40 to 50 years that the rest of the world will understand this. And so he was exactly right. The end point, of course, I think the last book that Wattenberg wrote, I think, was in 2002. I think he wrote a book called Fewer. I think that was his last work. And then I think he passed away in 2008. But yeah, I would like to say that since then, his predictions, his prophecy, in a sense, have been completely vindicated. I would say there's nobody in the world now who denies that what we should expect is a very alarming contraction in the size of the population, which will lead inexorably to depressions, economic depression, bad economic conditions, and then, of course, political ramifications from that, and so on.
Yes. So just a little fact checking. He passed away in 2015.
2015. There we go. Thank you so much. Yeah.
And yeah, his last book was published in 2008. Fewer was his second to last. His last one was
Perfect.
Fighting Words: A Tale of How Liberals Created Neoconservatism. But
I haven't seen that one. I'll have to check it out.
yes, but as an aside, personally, I've never believed in the, I guess, overpopulation rhetoric.
Yeah. Yeah.
And certainly my mom didn't, because we had two boys in my house. She's always wanted to try for a girl, and I think she, absent the legal restrictions for doing so, I think she would. I think we'd have I would have more younger siblings.
Yeah.
To
Right.
to worry about if that has been the case.
Right. Right. Yeah.
So I guess with that in mind, why should we be concerned with the dwindling fertility rates across the US and the Western world in general?
Yeah. Well, I think there's at least three types of reasons we should be concerned about them. And maybe I'll go in order of, backwards order of importance, if that's fair. Well, at least in my own opinion about backwards order. And the third most important reason, I think, is the economics. So we can't have economic growth without population growth. Now, we could get periods of time without a growth in the labor supply if each person in the economy becomes more productive. So increased productivity, and people will talk about that. That's like the way we're going to get out of this problem. But the idea that we could become increasingly productive kind of forever, or, so we could sustain like high productivity growth enough to compensate for fewer workers. I think it's just a fantastical idea. And you do find the interface of those ideas with some people who are big proponents of AI, and they think that that's how it's going to work out. We're going to become more productive through increasingly cool, we'll say, technologies. I definitely think that's fantastical. So basically, economic growth cannot be sustained. And so as populations begin to shrink, and we know many countries are already shrinking, we should see economic contraction, a decrease in the goods and services that are available. What does that mean? It means declining quality of life. There are some reports right now, Canada's experiencing in many ways a decline in quality of life. Well, we'll see this. It will become more and more pronounced. And that's not good. I mean, if you're somebody who thinks that, apart and aside from the sinfulness of mankind, which is always present. In other words, can we ever escape some of the problems of humanity? Apart and aside from that, I mean, if you're somebody who thinks that it's great that when I have 8 children, half of them don't have to die as a young person. So child mortality is down, basic, access to healthcare, education. Those are all things that come with economic growth. Okay, so economics will get worse. They can't get better. They will have to get worse. I said, backwards order of importance. There will be political ramifications to this. So we know that when economics becomes challenging for people, I mean, this is true on the local level, when there aren't enough jobs for people and the economy is doing poorly, this contributes to political instability for sure. So we'll see that kind of political instability, I think, both inside of countries and outside of countries, or, intra-country. And I have to mention, it would be wrong not to mention that this will create tensions over the question of immigration, because countries will only be able to support their economies in the way that they like by recruiting immigrants. I think that countries understand this today, but I don't think people are very explicit about it. But what the dark thing that is going to happen, and it's dark, is that in the intermediate period, countries will, in a sense, have to compete for immigrants, and that's like not a terribly optimistic scenario when we think about what that looks like. So there are a lot of, I think that's profoundly important. And then, I'm kind of describing the bad news here. I mean, so politically, then the last part of this is the kind of, because countries will have to rely so much on immigration, is the challenging questions of how to define a national identity when you have to, import a lot of people who don't share your political history, your ethnic history. And we're already seeing a lot of this question on the table is driving a lot of the political questions of the day. And we don't speak a lot about how, let's say, even in the United States now, we're having so much debate about immigration and how to handle it. We don't speak often about the extent to which our lack of births contributes to our need for immigrants, and then our political tensions that arise. So it's downstream. Finally, I said in backwards order, at least for me, the most important reason to be worried about lower birth rates is the human consequence, where people have, I just want to say it directly. It's a great good to have a brother and a sister. In a world of smaller and smaller families, people will have fewer brothers and sisters. And in many cases, they will have no brothers and sisters. They will be single, only children. And they will have fewer cousins and aunts and uncles. And it's like all of the extended family and the immediate family will be smaller. So even if you thought about like holding all other things constant in society, and imagine 2 populations, one in which there are many, every person has many brothers and sisters for the same population size, and one in which people have almost no brothers and sisters, we would have to say that the one with greater family ties is a richer, happier society. It's a place where you take the best things about a brother and your sister, and you have now 6 of them and not one of them. So that has to decrease the amount of family love and affection and trust and the things that come from a robust family experience. And I think that's a human loss. I think that's a loss of meaning and happiness for people. So those are my at least 3 reasons to be concerned.
Now, going back to, I guess, the Malthusian line of argument, I find that there are two like significant prongs to or premises that they adopt.
Yes.
Well, the first one we've mentioned is yeah, the world's resources are limited and there's no way to cover the entire population. But the second premise is the one that I found out much later in life,
Mhm.
and the one that I found to be much more, pardon the word, sinister, and that being that poor people
Mhm.
have more children than wealthy or well-off ones.
Yeah.
And of course, that carries on to the scary eugenicist
Yeah.
movement that took over your country in the first half of the
Yeah.
20th century, as well as other parts of the
Yeah.
European world as well. And you've mentioned earlier that uh, economic growth and population growth cannot be separated. So,
Mhm.
how would you tackle this, the second leg of this argument that poor people have more children, and therefore, I guess,
Yeah. Yeah. Um, and yeah, and so I'm glad you mentioned it. It's I mean, the first thing to say is we have to mention it, but it brings us to this question, right? Is human life good, even in bad conditions, or is it only good in certain conditions? And that what fueled the eugenic view was that there were kind of inherent, um, let's say, evils in the poor population, things that would certainly be passed down from generation to generation, and they were defective, right? They were defective. A tendency for instance, early eugenicists put together in one basket poverty, abuse of drugs and alcohol, um, promiscuity. They basically believed that all of these kind of bad human behaviors were always and everywhere going to go together. And they basically thought if you could stop poor people from reproducing, you could get rid of drunkenness in society. If you could stop poor people from reproducing, you could get rid of promiscuity from society and keep going. I mean, right. So, I mean, first of all, this is just false. So, the first thing to do is to be much more careful about our social research. And certainly was true in the time of the eugenicists. There were people who found those views, both erroneous and reprehensible. But it's increasingly true today. I think it's one of the reasons why, in spite of the fact that I think many social scientists have failed to provide insight and wisdom, I don't think we should give up on social science. I don't think we should reject all of it because, as you say, like tackling this other piece, right, is poverty alone. Is poverty something that causes or um, always always shows up with this host of other social ills? And I would say that there are people today helping us to understand that it's not true. So, for instance, just to take one important counterexample to that problem, what we understand today is that I mean, I think I was just thinking somebody like Rob Henderson has recently drawn attention to this, that there are, if we go ahead and we look at people who experience poverty, and we go ahead and we account for the families and the role of family in the experience of poverty, especially as a child, we see profoundly that you can be poor with functional, loving parents who provide a stable environment, and those children don't have any of those other problems of the kind of crime or the drug abuse, those sorts of things, or they're vastly, protected from those things. So poverty doesn't operate in the way that the early eugenicists believed. It doesn't operate that way. They believed poverty was a way of seeing in society that certain human beings, and how will you know? Well, they're the ones that are poor, but certain human beings are born in a defective way. They have bad genes, right? So, and we want to have the people with the good genes. And so, look, it's just a terrible false view of human nature. It's a terrible false view of how society works, and it neglects the most important things. So that's how I would tackle it, is by just more careful exposure of the truths. So we know that poverty itself is not a sign that somebody is defective, or that they don't they don't have the resources, the physical, biological, or mental resources to succeed. Now we could talk a lot more about but basically, if you look through the 20th century at the social statistics, we find that once you account for family structure and stable families, and we can say, well, what helps families be stable? Well, we have to look at things like religious contribution of churches and communities. But once you account for family structure, we see that the apparent problem of poverty and the related things that go with it, those things are not so important as predictors of social outcomes. And we know that actually with stable families, generations, in fact, tend to improve on their parents. In other words, the tendency in general is that with stable families, the passing on of virtue from parents to children, we see in general that children do better than their parents, and their children do better than their grandparents. So that there's a kind of a nice fit between what we expect from economic growth and what we expect the role of the family to be. So yeah, those are the kinds of things I would use to attack that other side, that dark side, because it is dark and it's evil, and I think it's based on a false reading of the statistics.
Okay. So I remember my parents tell me about the circumstances leading to my birth, and mom said that it was a rather difficult one.
Mm.
It was mercifully less difficult for my younger brother, who was born 6 years after.
Okay.
And my dad said to me something that made me remember forever. He said that um, when you were born, I quote him to paraphrase him,
Mhm.
I was born, and by that he means he was born as a father. So that likens to that Wordsworth line, "Child is a father to the man," and it really struck me. And I guess
Mm.
I guess I heard this line when I was around like 18 or 19, right? And
Wow. Wow.
between the ages of 8 and that age, I was like
Mm.
in my childish adolescent mind. I I determined that I didn't want to have kids.
Mm. Mm.
Um, I'm sure most boys and
Yeah.
girls around that age would think that
Yeah.
way.
Yeah.
Um, but I brought up the story in order to ask you this question. To what extent is having children beneficial to the man, the husband, as he
Mhm.
becomes a father?
Mhm. Well, first of all, thank you for sharing such a story. I'm very emotional to hear that. It's a really beautiful expression of something that I heard in my interviews. And so, of course, my research focus on women. Um, and I've said in other places, I hope to do a similar project in relation to men and fathers. But I'm really moved by it because a central focus of my interviews with mothers, a central focus was a question of identity and how women who made the choice to have many children, which is unusual today, how they ended up understanding themselves. In part because they're doing something different and unusual, which creates a possibility of maybe feeling marginalized or like a misunderstood, but also in part because I think there is this sense, and I'll maybe the view that you said maybe that you had when as a young man, I think it's very common. The view is that, okay, it takes such a long time as a young person. I mean, when you're 20, you think you've lived a long time, and you are struggling to understand yourself and you're struggling to become who you are and to understand yourself as different from your parents. We all understand this. This is, in fact, quite interesting. And the temptation is to think when we're 20 or 22 or as a single person in the world, when we've understood ourselves as different from our parents. I think the temptation now is to think, now I know who I am. Like now I know who I am. And the whole maybe internal struggle is to understand ourselves as different from our progenitors. Like, I'm not my dad, I'm not my mom. And that, depending on the type of parent you have, that could be incredibly important. And so in the face of that is a kind of like moment of understanding who you are as separate from your parents. It does seem pretty strange to think that giving rise to a person, becoming a parent, wouldn't, in a sense, be a threat to this self-identity you've created, right? Now you know who you are. Well, what kind of a person will I be with this other person, giving rise to this other person? So I think it's pretty common, at least I would say for women, and I can't speak for men, but I would say it's pretty common to have the sense that, at least initially, the child is a possible threat to the identity that has been created. And because we don't understand family dynamics very well. And I think we don't understand them because they're deep. And I think we don't, it's just hard. Meaning, I don't know that we ever did better in the past. And I think we still work at it. What's happened in modernity is that we've placed our identity, kind of what I am, who I am in our work, in our professional identities. I think mainly because it's easy. It's just easy. It's lazy. Right. So who I am as I'm a philosopher, who I am as an economist, who I am as what I study, or who I am as what I do. But who I am actually, where like identity is actually built, it's understood in relationship to other persons, right? Because my identity cannot be built in relation to a tree or it has to be in relation to something commensurate to who I am. So if I'm an eternal, rational being, then I have to understand myself in relation to other eternal rational beings. So my identity, in fact, is in relation. And because we don't understand that, we don't understand how we become adults, then the child can look like a threat to that internal identity. And it isn't. The child is not a threat. I think the child is not a threat, but it's because we don't understand that we're kind of the chrysalis that has to become the butterfly. And the child is the invitation to the full man. In fact, without the child, we don't become the full man or the full woman. We're just an adolescent still. We're kind of in the final stage. And I think because we don't understand this, we don't talk about it because nobody has the wisdom of your father, who was a very wise man. We can build the child into a kind of a threat. And so here's what you do. When the child is a threat to your identity, you naturally seek to put the child in a kind of corner. And what that looks like, at least in the United States, I would say, and for professional women, it's very often that you see the first child comes and you are still doing what you're doing. You're a lawyer and you have a child. You are a painter and you have a child. And there's a limit to how many children you can have before it looks like you're going to have to put your lawyer self or your painter self in some kind of like competition. And so what it looks like is happening is that for women who, for whatever reason, continue to have children, they express, and these are the women in my book, they express a kind of shift, a shift in identity that takes place where you become the mother of these children, and you finally understand, only after kind of doing battle with this tension, that the mother in you is not going to diminish the lawyer in you or the artist in you. In fact, the mother in you isn't going to diminish the person you became when you left your parents, in a sense. So what I'm trying to express is obviously deep and philosophical, and it's not something that I think I can express perfectly here. But I do believe that what I heard across the interviews was most often something like what your dad expressed, which is that there's a second birth which takes place in becoming a parent. And we can resist that birth in the way that maybe a mother would be afraid of giving birth, because it is going to be painful. It's going to involve some change of seeing yourself in a different way. I look in the mirror and I'm this, but now I'm going to be this. And but at the end we go through it, and it's like I mean, I just maybe to bring it down to a practical level, I sometimes say to the young women that I know who are struggling with becoming moms, I say something like, be patient. Right now, you think it's very hard to build your child into everything that you do. You don't go to the bathroom by yourself anymore. You don't get dressed by yourself. You don't eat breakfast there's no time anymore that you're by yourself. But be patient. In 18 years, when your child moves away, you're going to think, who am I without my child? Like this child has become so much a part of me. I don't know who I am without my child. So yeah, it happens. And I think it's very wise what your father said. So I can't speculate about the role of becoming a dad for a man, but I think it must be and partly analogous to what I just described, some kind of shift. But that shift, you're so grateful for it later because you think, well, thank goodness, like who would I be without my children? What kind of a man or woman would I be without my children? I think it's a great phrase, and I'm so glad you shared it with me.
And I appreciate that. So I'm very much indebted to the works of the Eberstats,
Mhm.
Nicholas and
Yes,
Mary, for my
yes,
understanding of how demography can be destiny, so the
yes,
phrase goes.
yes.
I've actually conversed with Nicholas on this program,
Okay.
and so the reason I mention them is that Nicholas has done a tremendous amount of work researching the social political circumstances of South Korea,
Uh-huh.
whose birth
Yes.
rate is abysmal,
Yeah.
to put it mildly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and what I also learned is that in South Korea, the gender politics is also very divisive.
Mm.
On one hand, you have a very strong component of feminism, the kind of women's liberation feminism of
Okay.
reminiscent of, I suppose, the second wave in your country.
Okay.
And on the other hand, a corresponding growing movement of, I suppose, men's rights activism.
Hmm.
I guess the in the internet, there's this community called Men Going Their Own Way, or MGTOW.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Um, so these two coexist, and the latter of the
Mm-hmm.
communities, the anti-feminist males,
Mm-hmm.
they are one of the key voting demographics for the current president.
Mm-hmm.
And
Hmm.
this is a dangerous cocktail because aside from this lofty ideals of self-realization that you've just
Yeah.
articulated, there's also a growing sense of one gender seeing the other as the adversary rather than,
Mm-hmm.
I guess, an ally or a
Yeah.
companion. And I
Yeah.
suppose in a lower level of intensity that is happening in America as well. So
Yeah.
how would you how would you
Yes.
say to either a young man or a young woman that is harboring these ideas?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, one of the things that I learned in my research, and that I think is a kind of the antidote to these ideas, is the power of experience or habit over idea. So what we have to say about a place like South Korea is that if you have a birth rate of below one, dramatically below one, that everybody doesn't have a sibling already. It's already happened. We're seeing essentially the outcome of a whole society of only children. And in a sense, what's needed is an idea about the complementarity. I mean, I think you're raising this, right? So you've got women that are going their own way, and then the men are going their own way, right? So so the ideal of complementarity between the strengths and the weaknesses, really, of the two sexes, that is not something that they're experiencing. They're not seeing it and not experiencing it. So, so first, now I understand why that wouldn't be something you could easily explain an idea. I think it's something that like has to be felt. So in an interesting sense, I think the thing that can change the heart when the heart is confused about the possibility, because that's right what it is. It's like there's a lack of belief. Like the people don't believe in love in a sense, right? They don't believe actually that, right? Because as much as, I believe in an institutional understanding of marriage and so on, I mean, it's fair to say that at the heart of that is a belief that that in fact love can bridge the divide, but the apparent divide between, well, men gain nothing from marriage. You hear that. Women, in fact, gain nothing from marriage. So you can see like, well, in that place, but in fact, love is still possible. You can fall in love, and that the what love tells us, right, in emotionally, it can be true. It can, in fact, be true that so you'd want to talk about love as an idea and as a possibility, but I don't think you can communicate it as a proposition in the way we communicate propositions. I think what changes the heart is seeing that it is in fact a lived possibility. So what I'm speaking about really is witness or testimony. So for people, of course, you can't make people seek out witness if they don't want it. But for people who are looking for it, actually, like in a sense, to go on a journey and to look for it. So a lot of the women that I talked to had come up in communities that were like the one you just described. And what caused them to change was meeting people who were living a completely different way of life, almost like you meet somebody from another planet. You go, oh my goodness, like, I come out of this universe where men don't trust women and women don't trust men, and they're both building a life separate. And then they meet somebody who to them it could be like as foreign as an alien. They go, like, I didn't even know people could have 3 or 4 children. Well, I didn't know you could be happily married. I didn't know these things were possible. So there's a kind of like curiosity that people could have, and then to follow that curiosity and talk to people, meet people, like live with people. My husband and I have had lots of young men and women visit our home over the years in different circumstances, live with us for a few weeks or a few months. And oftentimes this is what you get. Like, I didn't know people could live this way. So I actually think that what's needed in today's crisis, in a sense, is witness more than argument, because I think what's lacking is experience, not ideas. If that's fair to say.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I think about that quip often attributed to the late Henry Kissinger, something
Mm.
like the battle of the sexes is impossible because there's too much fraternizing with the enemy.
Yeah. It's a great one. I mean, yeah, of course, most of us who are married admit, like marriage between a man and a woman is, in a sense, it's impossible. I think didn't Chesterton say something like marriage is a battle to the death that no honorable man should pass up. I mean, it's like it looks impossible because we are so different. And yet, like Kissinger says, I mean, we are drawn to each other. The yin and the yang. It's eternal that we need each other. We keep drawing back to the person that fits our weaknesses. I like to focus on that too, right? So, and this is what we're missing in this debate. Like, for instance, this discussion of toxic masculinity, so-called toxic masculinity. Well, you can't get the strengths of masculinity without the weaknesses of masculinity. And so if we want to build a world in which no man has the strength to do bad things, we will also build a world in which no man has the strength to do great things with his strength. And of course, we can say the same. There's toxic femininity, of course. And if we want to build a world in which women are not equipped to say, read the soul of other people. It's just the kind of thing that women are very good at doing. That's a strength. It's what makes us great mothers. It's what makes us great friends. We want to build a world in which women don't have the bad side of that, which is our interest in gossip, our interest in the lives of others, which sometimes becomes, completely disordered. We will also build a world in which women don't have those gifts. So I think that's to Kissinger's point. Certainly, it's like we have to be willing to. And this is true, like your best friend, whoever it is, your best friend, they have strengths and they have weaknesses, but you recognize that humans are these packages. We don't get the strengths without the weaknesses. I think that's true for men and women. And the goal isn't to eliminate the differences that give rise to these amazing capacities. The goal is to understand how to develop the strengths and direct them to wholesomeness, right? Direct the strength of a man to something wholesome and good. And goodness, we have a lot at our disposal. And I think, thank goodness of so many people who are talking about how to do that better in a like post-Christian, post-crisis of the West society. Yeah.
Okay. So I'd like to end where we begin, so to speak. So of the Hannahs, i.e. the women that you profiled, I guess, as well as from your own experience, to what extent is the religious convictions that you share inform your views of children?
Yes. Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that I'm really struggling to fully understand what I think is true about children. One of the things that my book raises is the importance of desiring children for their own sake. The women I interviewed desired children for their own sake. What does it mean to desire a child for the sake of the child and not for some other sake? So it's a distinction between desiring a child because the child is good, versus desiring a child because I want to be a mother, right? Now, there's nothing wrong with wanting to be a mother. I'm not, but to be a mother is something about me, right? Something about me. It's not to desire the child for the child's own sake. And I'm increasingly convinced of a couple of things that absent certain convictions about God and the meaning of life, which derive from religion, absent those convictions, it is very difficult for a society to sustain the love of children for their own sakes. Because in fact, children are hard to love for their own sakes. Because, in the very short and immediate, even middle to long term, children make a lot of demands on us. They cost something and they shift our way of life, all these things we've talked about. And so, and we've also seen just sort of in the 20th century, in the advent of good family planning or good birth control, that people are very quick to use it. They like to be able to limit their family size. I mean, we've talked about Vietnam. Certainly everybody knows about China. There are these, absurd cases of governments doing immoral things to limit family sizes. But in most parts of the world, we didn't need the government to do it. People willingly said, I'd really like to just have one or two children because, more than that is really tough. It's really a pain. Don't know if I want to do it. And so this is the thing I'm grappling with. Why is it today that it's mostly very devoutly religious people who have more than 1.6 children? And I think it's because these are people who value the child itself for its own sake and beyond just becoming a parent, becoming a mother. And I think that conviction is usually going to come from this kind of biblical idea that children are a blessing from God. So why would you desire them for their own sakes? Well, because God wants to bless you, right? So why would you put an obstacle to get a blessing from God? And of course, like the lived experience of human life is that children are a blessing, but it takes us sometimes, 20 or 30 years to feel that deeply, to feel that deeply. So yeah, just to finish up, I think increasingly persuaded that it's not correct to say that children are by nature an object of desire, by nature an object of desire apart from what they can bring to us, or what they can give to us. And so in a society where children bring us labor or other, desirable values, support in our old age, for instance, then I think we would see people desiring to have children, but for the sake of these other goods. But when we don't need children for those goods, like labor or support in our old age, I don't know how desirable children are outside of what they bring to us. And so how many children do you need to have to be a fulfilled adult? Just one. I mean, one child makes you a parent. Maybe in some places you have a preference for a boy and a girl. And so maybe it's two children. But we are clearly seeing that absent certain religious convictions about children being blessings or desirable in themselves, we are not likely to see people sustaining birth rates above 1.6, I think. So I began with a conviction when I started this project that religion was important somehow to the future of birth rates. But I think I finished with a much clearer idea of what that means, that children are important. And I think it means that religious persons, people with let's say a strong biblical faith, are able to surmount the difficulties of having children because they deeply believe that children are worth having for their own sakes.
That's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you very much, Catherine.
You're welcome.
Pakaluk, for joining the show.
You're welcome.
And of course, happy Easter to you and yours.
Thank you. To you too.